When the door closed behind John for the last time, the house seemed to lose its life. Emptiness spilled into every corner, filling every crack. I often stood in the middle of a room, not knowing what to do next. His absence was as overwhelming as his presence had once been a source of peace. We had lived together for so long that I had grown used to feeling him even when he was in another room. Now he was gone entirely. Each morning, I woke up hoping to see him beside me. I would have made him coffee, and we would sit together in the kitchen discussing the little things, so ordinary yet so important. But as the day began, reality set in, and I realized it wouldn't happen. Instead of the sound of his footsteps, the house was filled with absolute silence. It pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, under which breathing was impossible. Sometimes I found myself wondering where he was. What did he look like out there, in the war? Could I even imagine him in that role? I knew John was a strong man, but the thought of him facing something terrible wouldn't leave my mind. Each of his rare calls was filled with calm and confidence, but I sensed the tension he tried to hide between the lines. One day, I felt as though someone was watching me. It was a strange, persistent feeling, as if someone's eyes were on me, even though I was alone. I turned around several times, but there was nothing. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just paranoia, a result of long solitude and endless worries. Yet the thought lingered and I couldn't completely shake it. The noise of the city helped me momentarily distract myself from the loneliness as I decided to take a walk. The center was crowded with people, yet to me it still felt empty. I wandered aimlessly, trying to forget about the house and the void inside me, which nothing seemed able to fill. And then I saw a familiar face, Alex, John's nephew, walking toward me with an easy smile. There was something comforting in his gaze, as if he was part of my past, a time when everything felt simpler. "Laura, how are you?" He approached, and his voice suddenly brought me back to reality. "Hi, Alex. I'm fine," I replied, though I knew very well that wasn't true. We exchanged some small talk about everyday life and mundane things. But at some point I realized I didn't want this conversation to end. "Want to grab lunch together?" I suggested. It was spontaneous, but it suddenly felt right. Alex agreed without hesitation, and we headed to a small diner not far from the center. Inside, the simple and cozy atmosphere helped me relax. We sat down, and Alex immediately picked a huge burger from the menu. Not wanting to be left out, I ordered the same, but when the food arrived, I realized it wouldn't be easy to handle. Trying to take a bite out of the giant burger, I felt part of the filling fall straight onto the plate. Alex noticed and burst out laughing, and I couldn't help but laugh along with him. "Are you sure you can handle that?" he teased, and I shook my head, trying to stay serious, but it was impossible. That light, funny moment seemed to awaken something in me, something long forgotten. We laughed together, and it brought us closer. I began to feel a subtle tension in the air, something barely noticeable. There was something in his gaze that I hadn't seen before, but I chose to ignore it. After all, Alex was just John's nephew, and we were simply enjoying each other's company. When I returned home after meeting with Alex, the house once again engulfed me with its silence. Outside, the sun still clung to the day, but inside my heart, dusk was already settling. My footsteps echoed dully down the hallway like in an abandoned building. Every corner of the house felt empty. The silence that I once could tolerate now pressed down on me even harder. I kept thinking back to how much fun we had at the diner, Alex and I. Our laughter, his teasing, the ease with which we communicated. It was a moment where I felt alive, free from all the heavy thoughts. But now that feeling was slipping away, leaving behind an even deeper void. I started pacing through the rooms, unsure of what to do with myself. In each of them, the silence and loneliness seemed to claw at me. Even the small things, an empty cup on the table, books on the shelf, all reminded me of how long it had been since John was here, but his absence no longer felt like just a loss. It seemed to amplify the emptiness. My thoughts drifted back to Alex again. I remembered how easily we laughed together. A strange warmth spread through me as I thought about it. And then the thought crossed my mind. Why not invite him over? It would at least break this unbearable sense of isolation, even if just for a while. John was far away, and he would never know. The thought slipped in so easily, so naturally, but I felt it settle firmly in my mind. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching my phone, wondering if I should message Alex. Maybe just a friendly visit to distract me? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the loneliness. Something had changed. The way I looked at Alex, his smile, his jokes. It all suddenly meant more to me than it should. But I pushed those thoughts away, convincing myself that it was just a way to cope with the emptiness. Loneliness tightened its grip on me again, and I couldn't find peace. Thinking back to my recent lunch with Alex, I realized how much I wanted to relive that lightness and carefree feeling. It was like a breath of fresh air I desperately needed. I hesitated for a long time, but eventually I made a decision. I messaged Alex, inviting him to come over that evening. He replied quickly, agreeing without hesitation. When Alex arrived, the evening was already drawing to a close. The usual silence hung in the house, but his presence immediately seemed to fill the room with new energy. We sat in the kitchen, made tea, and began talking about little things. I don't remember exactly what we talked about. The words flowed on their own, and I felt strangely at ease. But something was different. As time passed, I began to notice the tension between us. At first, it was barely noticeable, but then it grew, like a string being slowly pulled tighter. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual. My heart began to race every time his hand accidentally brushed against mine. This wasn't like our previous meetings. Something had changed. My thoughts drifted back to that day at the diner. Maybe I had already sensed something between us then, but I pushed it away. Now, in the quiet of our house, I could no longer ignore it. I could feel that there was something more between us than just family ties. I looked at Alex and realized he felt the same. Our conversation suddenly slowed, and silence settled between us. It was a sign. Before I could even think it through, I leaned forward. I kissed him. At first, Alex froze, but then he kissed me back. It was the moment we both understood that we had crossed a line and everything had changed. I felt excitement, fear, and something else. Something forbidden, yet inevitable. After that kiss, everything changed. I felt alive, filled with a strange energy that both scared and excited me. An inner voice told me that I had crossed a line, but instead of fear, something else was growing inside me. Excitement, thrill, the sense that everything was now in my control. Alex and I never spoke about what had happened. It was like an unspoken agreement. Not to ask too many questions, not to search for explanations. But within me, a thought began to form that our time together shouldn't end with these occasional meetings. I wanted him to be around more often, to keep this feeling of vitality that I had rediscovered from fading away. One evening, when Alex was at my house again, I began to think about how to prolong this sensation. Too much had happened in such a short time, and I didn't want to go back to the emptiness. An idea came to me. At first, it seemed crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more right it felt. "Alex," I paused before continuing, "why don't you stay here? Just for a while. You're my nephew after all, and no one would suspect anything strange." He froze for a moment, seemingly processing what I had just said. I saw doubt flash in his eyes. "Stay here? But what would John say if he ever found out?" "John won't find out," I replied confidently. In that moment, I realized I truly believed in my ability to hide our relationship. He was far away and we could keep playing this game without anyone noticing. Alex, still hesitant, looked at me, but I could see his doubts beginning to fade. I knew he felt the tension between us too, and he didn't want it to end. "I'll think about it," he finally said. But I already understood that his answer was more yes than no. He liked being here, liked what was happening between us. I felt like I was in control now. If Alex stayed, it would give me the opportunity to hide our actions under the guise of family ties. No one would suspect that there could be anything more between us. I became more confident, knowing that we had this chance to be together, and no one would suspect a thing. Alex had decided to stay with me for a while, just as I had suggested. I wasn't surprised when he agreed. It seemed like he needed it as much as I did. Now his presence in the house had become familiar. His belongings quietly filled a corner of the guest room, and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway no longer felt foreign. I tried to convince myself that it was all just for comfort. He was, after all, my husband's nephew, and no one should suspect anything. But deep down, I knew things were far more complicated than that. One evening, when the house was as quiet as usual, I stayed alone in my room. I lay on the bed, replaying in my mind the moment when Alex and I had kissed for the first time. The memory of his lips on mine and how we had crossed the line overwhelmed me once again. These thoughts wouldn't leave me, and I began to feel the same tension inside, just like that evening. I touched my lips, as if trying to hold on to the sensation, to relive the moment. My fingers traced over my body, unintentionally intensifying that strange but captivating excitement that had taken root then. My head was full of conflicting thoughts, but they all drowned in this overwhelming feeling. The door to my room was slightly ajar, and without noticing at first, I heard someone come in. It was Alex. He stood in the doorway, stunned. Our eyes met, and I realized that he had caught me in a way he clearly wasn't expecting to see. In that moment, everything froze. He didn't know what to say and quickly left without uttering a word, closing the door behind him. I was left alone, my heart pounding with embarrassment, but along with it, a strange arousal surged through me. That fleeting moment of eye contact only heightened the feelings I had been trying to suppress. I knew it wasn't supposed to happen, but I couldn't ignore how deeply his gaze had affected me. All evening, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in my room. The questions, the doubts, and that unfinished moment with Alex wouldn't leave my mind. What had he thought in that moment? What was he feeling now? I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Later that evening, when the house was steeped in silence, I decided to talk to Alex. He was sitting in the living room looking tense, as if he too had been thinking about the recent events. I took a deep breath and sat down beside him, starting the conversation. "Alex," I began softly, afraid to break the fragile atmosphere that hung in the air. "We need to talk about what happened earlier." He didn't say anything, but I could see his shoulders tense, and his gaze avoided mine. I placed my hand on his, trying to make the gesture both gentle and decisive. The tension between us, which had been subtle, began to build again. His hand under my fingers seemed to tremble with anticipation. "I don't want to stop here, Alex," I whispered as I moved closer. I felt his breathing slow, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same desire I felt inside. Our lips met again in a kiss, and this time I couldn't stop. His touch was hot, desperate, as if this moment was a long-awaited release for both of us. I whispered in his ear, "This time I don't want to stop." He answered only with a passionate kiss, and we both let the moment consume us completely. No doubts, no caution, just desire, overpowering all reason. We forgot about everything. About John, about the danger, and about the possibility of being seen. But unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. We didn't know that we were being watched. Before John left, he had installed cameras in the house. And now, our secret meetings, our passionate moments, everything was being captured, unseen by us but visible to him. We were fully immersed in our secrets and passion, unaware that it would lead to consequences that would change everything. Alex and I lived under the false impression that no one knew about what was happening between us. Our secret meetings in the house, our efforts to avoid being noticed by neighbors, all seemed like the perfect way to conceal our relationship. But, as is often the case, that sense of security was nothing but an illusion. Our neighbor Tom, who lived across the street, had always seemed a bit odd to me. He was a solitary, quiet man who spent most of his time indoors. I never gave much thought to his presence, but as it turned out, he was far more interested in us than we could have imagined. One evening, while I was spending time with Alex again, Tom happened to notice us through the window. My behavior, our closeness, it all aroused his suspicions. He couldn't look away and decided he had to find out what was really going on. Armed with binoculars, he began spying on us. At first, it was just occasional glimpses, but his curiosity grew with each passing day. Soon, his suspicions were confirmed. However, Tom wasn't just watching us from his window. Before John left, he had given Tom access to the cameras installed in our house. In case something went wrong, Tom was supposed to keep an eye on things. But now, Tom used this opportunity to spy on us, watching everything unfold. The footage from the cameras was fed directly to his house, and he saw our secret meetings and our growing intimacy. Every move we made was captured on video. Armed with this evidence, Tom began sending the recordings to John, who was far from home. John received the videos of our passionate encounters and fully understood what was happening behind his back. His anger grew with each new file that Tom sent him. Alex and I continued to live in the belief that our relationship had gone unnoticed, but in reality, we were being watched. We had become victims of our own naivety, unaware that every step we took was being recorded and sent to John through Tom. Far from home, John sat in front of the screen, watching the video recordings that Tom continued to send him. With each new clip, his anger grew like a snowball rolling down a steep hill. What he saw left no room for doubt. Laura, his wife of so many years, was betraying him with Alex, his own nephew. Every frame struck him like a punch to the gut. These moments that he had never wanted to witness. Their closeness, their touches, their kisses. It was all right in front of him, impossible to ignore. His rage mixed with despair. He felt utterly betrayed, as if his entire life had collapsed in front of him. John clenched his fists so tightly that he nearly broke the chair he was sitting on. One thought pulsed in his mind. He needed to return home immediately and deal with this. But reason told him it would be suicide. His return without authorization would be considered desertion. It could end in catastrophe, not just for his career but for his future. He was trapped. He couldn't just let this go, but he couldn't return either. Every action between Laura and Alex felt more humiliating and offensive to him. He wanted to scream, to break everything around him, but instead, cold fury settled in as he began to decide how to proceed. John realized he had to act remotely. He couldn't allow Laura and Alex to continue living as if nothing had happened. He knew he needed to punish them both. His thoughts swirled around plans, figuring out the best way to do this without returning home, but ensuring that his actions would be devastating for them. Another file notification blinked on his screen, yet another confirmation of their affair. John, gritting his teeth, made his decision. He wouldn't return now, but his actions would make them feel like he was always there, even from a distance. Laura and Alex had no idea that his judgment was already hanging over them, ready to strike. I never imagined that one day I would be standing in front of strangers who were intruding into my life with an eviction notice. When two men in official uniforms appeared at my door, I couldn't understand what was happening at first. They were talking about documents, about property rights that no longer belonged to me. "Ma'am, you are no longer registered at this address," one of them said, looking at me sternly. "You are required to vacate the premises." "What are you talking about? There must be some mistake." My heart raced and panic overwhelmed me. I tried to comprehend how this could be possible. This was still my home. But the man's words hit me like a hammer. John, he had done something. I could feel it. He had transferred the house, stripped me of all rights. Anger and despair flooded through me, and it felt as though the ground was falling out from under me. Could this really be happening? "You have a few days to vacate. We'll provide you with the necessary paperwork," the other man added, leaving no room for hope. And then my phone rang. It was the last thing I expected at that moment. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and saw John's mother's name on the screen. My heart skipped a beat. What could she possibly have to say? Were they involved in this too? "Laura." Her voice was anxious and confused. "John called us and said he transferred all his assets to us. We don't understand. What's going on?" I heard her words, but their meaning wouldn't sink in. Everything felt like a fog. How? Not only had he taken the house from me, but he had also removed me from it, as if I were nobody. I tried to gather my thoughts, but only questions swirled in my head. Why had he done this? What for? My world had collapsed around me. When the door closed behind the officers, I wasn't alone. Alex was standing beside me, just as shocked by what was happening. His face was pale, and I could see the same fear and confusion in his eyes that I felt inside. The house that had once been my refuge had suddenly turned into a cage, one I would soon be forced to leave. Slowly, the realization sank in. John knew. He knew about me and Alex. He had taken steps to punish me, to strip me of everything I thought was mine. "What now?" Alex whispered, struggling to grasp the reality of it all. I couldn't answer. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely think straight. The only thought in my head was to contact John. I had to talk to him, explain, try to fix something, anything. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and started dialing his number over and over. But John didn't answer. With every unanswered ring, my desperation grew. I tried calling again and again, but all I got was silence. John had completely cut me out of his life, taken away every right, every connection. Now I was left with nothing. He had taken everything, the house, the inheritance, my future. Alex, sensing my distress, moved closer, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away. My panic and fear were only growing. I couldn't believe it had come to this. What now? I had lost everything, and no words from Alex could undo what had already been done. "We'll figure something out, Laura." His voice was soft, but there was hesitation in it. Even he didn't believe what he was saying. "Figure something out?" I laughed bitterly through my tears. "John has cut me out of his life. He's taken the house, everything I had. We're left with nothing." Alex fell silent, realizing how hopeless the situation truly was. We both stood there in a house that was no longer ours. Everything had fallen apart, and the future, which once seemed solid, had crumbled before us. Every day spent in this house felt like a reminder of how I had destroyed everything. Everything that once mattered was gone. It was as if the house was slowly crumbling around me, and I realized it wasn't just external circumstances. I had ruined my own life. What had once seemed like freedom through my connection with Alex now felt like a heavy burden, one that had dragged me down even deeper. I looked at Alex, sitting across from me on the couch, and I could see the concern in his eyes. He was trying to comfort me, saying we'd figure it out somehow, but his words no longer mattered. All I could see now was the result of our affair. I had lost the house, my future, my husband, and instead of feeling relief, all I felt was pain. "Alex, we need to talk," I finally said, my heart tightening, but I knew it was necessary. "About what?" His voice was cautious, as if he already sensed that this conversation wouldn't be easy. I took a deep breath, gathering the strength to say what had been swirling in my mind since the officers left our house. "This has gone too far. I can't do this anymore," I said, lowering my eyes. "Our affair has destroyed everything, and if I want to have any chance of getting my life back, I need to end this." Alex looked at me, his face a mix of surprise and hurt. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped. He understood. He knew I was right, that continuing this relationship would only make things worse. "Do you really want to do this?" he asked quietly, though there was no anger in his voice, only sadness. "I have to, Alex," I replied, and this time my words felt certain. I knew there was no other way. "I've lost everything. I can't lose myself entirely." He lowered his head and sighed quietly. We both knew this was inevitable. He was upset, but he didn't try to argue. We had gone too far, and our actions had led us to something we couldn't undo. "Laura," he began, but then fell silent, as if he didn't know what else to say. "I hope you understand," I said, standing up from the couch. "It's not because I don't feel anything for you, I just can't live in this chaos anymore." Alex didn't respond. He just sat there, lost in his thoughts, and while the pain was evident in him, he knew I was right. This was the end. Now I was alone. The emptiness that once seemed distant had swallowed me whole. I sat in this house which no longer belonged to me, and couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen apart. My desire to start a new life, to free myself from the past, seemed so distant. With every passing moment, the weight of my mistakes pressed down on me even more. Losing John didn't just hurt, it left a gaping hole inside me. Despite our differences and the betrayal that had shattered our marriage, I still felt something deep for him. But he refused to talk to me. Any attempt to reach him, calls or messages, went unanswered. His silence spoke louder than words. It tore me apart, leaving me feeling utterly powerless. I had lost not only John, but everything I once thought was secure. The house, which had been my safe haven, now felt like a stranger's place, even though I was still in it. The inheritance I might have relied on was gone to his parents, along with any hope for the future. I was trapped between a past I had destroyed and a future that no longer existed. Alex. I tried to convince myself that ending things with him was the right decision. that it would give me a chance to regain some control over my life. But instead of relief, all I felt was emptiness. My relationship with him had been the final blow I dealt to myself, and now he was gone too, leaving me even more isolated. I tried to start anew, but every day was full of reminders. The past haunted me, preventing me from moving forward. Tom, my neighbor who had once watched me, now barely paid me any attention. His interest faded as my life crumbled. I was no longer a threat to him, and his cold indifference only highlighted how alone I had become. Now I was just a shadow of who I used to be, trying to find some meaning in this chaos. But all I could do was stare into the void, unsure of what would come next. Loneliness had become my constant companion. The days blurred into one, and every morning reminded me of how far I had gone down the path of self-destruction. My life, which I once considered stable and predictable, had turned into chaos, leaving only ruins behind. I had lost everything: my home, my husband, my relationship with Alex. But now, left alone with myself, I realized that the only path left was to start over. This wasn't a decision that came easily. Every morning I woke up feeling empty, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life after everything that had happened. I felt the pain of my mistakes, regretted every step that had led me to this point. But gradually the realization came. There was no other way. I couldn't reclaim my past, but I could try to create something new. I stepped out of the house for the last time, looking back at the empty rooms. Every corner of this house held memories, but those memories were no longer a source of comfort. They were a reminder of what I had lost. Closing the door behind me, I understood that with this farewell, I was closing a chapter of my life. Now a road lay ahead of me with no guarantees. I didn't know what awaited me, and that was frightening. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something new, a faint but real hope. In the chaos, I had finally realized that I had a choice. And although this new path would not be easy, it was my path. I would have to rebuild everything step by step, despite the pain and loss. The world around me had changed, but in that uncertainty, I found strength. I knew I could no longer rely on anyone, that I would have to find strength within myself. This was my new journey, and I was ready to begin it no matter the challenges that lay ahead.